I'm Emma Davies. I work at the University of East London, and I'm leading a project called Beyond Adversity, looking at how we work together to create a trauma-informed institution.
Thank you. And what is trauma-informed practice?
In essence, it's a way of being. It's a way of communicating and an understanding of some of the stuff that people are going through and why they may react in particular ways. So it's about understanding the impact of trauma on people's lives and seeking to resist inadvertently re-traumatizing and asking too many questions. So it really isn't about delving into people's trauma past, but more about understanding. So it's not about asking lots of questions. It's more about patience, sensitivity, compassion, safety. And by safety, I mean emotional safety as well as physical stuff. It's about trustworthiness and about sharing power, really, and enhancing people's autonomy. So it's a broad set of principles, really, that sit underneath how one responds, probably to everybody, but in particular, it'll have the most impact where it comes to people who have experienced traumatic issues of various kinds in the past, particularly early in the life.
As a teacher or an educator, why is being trauma-informed important for us?
Because in essence, it's a good way of helping to support students to flourish. Everybody experiences stress, and of course that can be helpful and is a good thing. Yeah. But toxic stress, which often comes from traumatic experiences, particularly early in life, can be overwhelming and can have profound impact on learning and behavior. There's lots of science on it. And some behaviors, some of the stuff that we see in classrooms that are sort of fight or flight stuff, where people might react very quickly, aggressively, or the flip side, withdraw, can be survival mechanisms in some situations, but unsurprisingly not particularly adaptive in the classroom. So understanding that dynamic can be really useful to enable students to succeed, to flourish, and to have more agency in their lives.
Yeah, I know there's a fair amount of research that shows that the schools are becoming more trauma-informed, but why is there a need for trauma-informed practice within higher education as well?
Well, it's really the same issue as in schools. It can help people. It's the same dynamic. It's just a bit later in life. It's odd in a way that higher education has been a bit slower than schools to pick this up. It's also, I think, important in our university, for example. Many of our students have children and are older. So it's not only about our students, but also about the impact on the next generation. So same issues as for schools in terms of education and learning and enabling, empowering students to flourish. But there's an added dimension there where if I'm a student with young children, that can be useful in terms of my parenting too.
But how else can it impact students in a positive way to help them flourish in education?
Going to help students to feel safer, develop trust, which for some it may be the first time, and feeling more empowered, more able to make choices, decisions, and have more agency. It's partly about enabling and supporting people to develop their own choices and their own paths. So as a student, all of that is hugely important in terms of kind of human flourishing, if you like, living a good life, but also in terms of employability, that a lot of these kinds of issues and soft skills that you can develop through that can be useful not only in the educational context per se, but also in a whole range of other contexts in our lives. Fourier once commented, one of the theorists around pedagogy, that the best way to learn to make decisions is to actually make them. And although that sounds very simple, I think that's quite important. It's about, and in some ways it's about practicing through university with support. and learning that it is fundamentally relational, learning that you can actually trust people to make their commitments, to do what they say they're going to do, to be transparent, all those kind of principles, which can help students to feel safer, more grounded, less anxious. And then you start getting into a process where people are feeling more able and more in control to be able to succeed. As I say, it's been slower than in schools. As far as I'm aware, there are a few universities in the United States that have been doing quite a lot of work on this. And in Wales, I'm aware of one that's been looking at this. I'm aware the University of Chester, some departments in there have been looking at this. In Wales, it's in Wrexham. I think Aberystwyth did a little bit of work on this, but I'm not sure how far it's gone. And they're also in some Scottish institutions. So I'm aware that this is permeating into higher education. I don't know the extent to which it's gone very far. The literature, so the academic literature on it is very sparse, but I think it's emerging and developing more and more. Well, in essence, all of those principles and the ways of being, if you like, or the ways of thinking about trauma-informed practice isn't just about students. It's also about staff. So giving staff agency and using those same principles can potentially lead not only to more resilient staff, but also more productive staff. So it's a virtuous circle, if you like. So enabling and empowering staff enables them to feel resilient. That resiliency can enable them to be able to support students. You can't support other people on an empty tank. So it's really important that those principles apply to the way that you work with staff as well as with students. Ultimately, as an employer, if I'm looking for resilient, empowered staff who make effective decisions, who are able to be more productive, that's got to be a good move as an employer.
Becoming trauma informed, or embedding that within my practice, or having my institution becoming trauma informed?
Well, one of the first things that people talk about is that much the same way, that whole idea that if you look after staff, those staff look after students. Looking after staff means looking after ourselves. So one of the things that as an employee, this lens does is enable me to reflect on my own processes, my own practices, and think about how I'm looking after myself or not. So what do I need to do to change and get that work-life balance, etc., to reduce the stress in my life, to enable me to feel more empowered, all those sorts of processes. So on a personal level, I think it can have some positive impact, perhaps particularly for those staff, although not exclusively, but for those people who have experienced trauma, either early in the lifespan or a bit later, and who haven't had an understanding of it can help to provide insight into why I behave in some ways as I do. So it can be useful as an insight and reflection of our own behavior, but it also enables me to do a better job. And I think most of us want to do a good job by our students. Most of us want to give them the best that we can, and knowing how to do that, and also reducing frustration sometimes. I think sometimes if we don't understand why our students, or a student in particular, might behave in the way they do, we may find that quite frustrating. If we understand a little bit more about where that might be coming from, it can help us to feel more compassionate and patient. As I say, this is not about asking lots of questions. It's really about standing back and understanding that some people react in particular ways for good reason, and that while it may be adaptive in some circumstances, what we may be seeing is maladaptive. That doesn't mean it wasn't a survival mechanism earlier in the lifespan. So it's about understanding that, sitting alongside and empowering. And in that process, that can be incredibly rewarding as staff, as an employee, to watch, to be a small part of somebody's journey, watching them flourish, is incredibly rewarding in my experience. So we well, as a course leader and as a academic advisor, I was experiencing a lot of disclosure by just asking students, how are you going?
Yeah.
And so I was a bit surprised by that. So I started to talk to others in different departments and was finding that a number of people were experiencing the same things. So I decided to do a systematic survey of first year level 4 students. So I had some fantastic interns who were magnificent from across the university, and I developed a survey in association with colleagues in the University of Ulster and Queen's University, and we including a number of standardized measures. So there's something called an ACE questionnaire, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire. It's a 10-item questionnaire that's been used around the world. It was developed in the 1990s by Vincent Felitti. And so we put that in. We used a standardized resilience measure, a Connor and Davidson measure. It's one of the most widely used in the world. We used an anxiety measure. We asked questions about quality of life. We asked questions about people's more recent traumatic experiences.
Yeah.
We've linked that data. That 860 students filled it out, and at level 4, and then we've linked that data with demographic data, and we will be able to link it with achievement data that comes from the university. So and what we've found so far is that UEL students have survived significantly more childhood and recent adversities than the general population and students at other universities where this kind of research has been done. So we've used some similar measures so that we can compare. So as an example, using the same question around sexual abuse, in the general population, UEL population of the students that responded to our survey, so it was actually 858 students, it was 3 times the rate of sexual abuse in the UEL student population compared to the general population. And these cumulative experiences impact students' projections about whether or not they will complete their degrees. So we asked them about that. We also asked them about self-reported quality of life, experiences of anxiety, and self-reported physical and mental health. And what we found is that how likely you are to complete your degree is highly correlated. So for those that might be listening to this that like the stats of this, the p-value is 0.001, so that's a very, very high, less than 0.001, but it's a very high correlation. So highly related to childhood adversities, stressful and more recent stressful events. Childhood adversities are highly related to current anxiety levels, self-reported quality of life, physical and mental health. Low resilience is very highly related to total childhood adversities, total recent stressful events, and self-reported experiences of discrimination. Now, because we asked lots of questions and it's a large survey, we only took p-values of 0.001, so that's highly significant. So it has a huge impact on the way that people experience things. So that's as far as we've got to date in terms of data. And I'm just about, I've just submitted an application, an ethics application. We have some funding to look at focus groups with staff and students to look at the implications of that data and to look at how to develop a trauma-informed policies and practices to enable more students to flourish. Ultimately, this has the potential to have a significant impact on retention and continuation of students at university. If we look at their self-reported stuff, how likely you're to complete your degree, there's a high correlation there. So has the potential in terms of retention, and it also has the potential in terms of achievement. So it has a potential, I think, for a step change in that, if we can get the policies and practices right. But this will take time. This isn't there's no magic answer. There's no magic bullet. There's a range of different things we can do at different levels of the institution in terms of practice and in terms of policy. And we will work our way through that together with students and staff over the coming months.
anyone who is interested in knowing more about the trauma-informed practice, is there any training or CPD available?
Within UEL, within the University of East London, there are still another couple of training days that people can do. They're 2 half-day sessions. So, and there are still a few spaces left in those. Outside of the university, the Wave Trust does some training on trauma-informed practice. And that are 1-day courses. When it comes to developing the plan within UEL, we may well find that it's a good idea to do more training with to put some as mandatory training or recommend that in terms of induction and such like, as well as sort of later on when people are in terms of staff, but also to more intensely train some people within each school. But that's something we need to think through.
And how is this different to or additional to the support that we get in the mental health and wellbeing departments that we have?
There are overlaps.
Yeah.
But this adds an important dimension, I believe, because if we don't recognize some of the experiences of many of our students, not in detail, but in terms of impact, then our interventions are going to miss. So to give you an example, there's a lot of talk in the mental health field about cognitive behavioral therapy, often called CBT. And CBT, without trauma-informed CBT, has some impact when it comes to the impact of trauma. But CBT on its own does not, and is not recommended in things like the Cochrane Collaboration and NICE guidelines and such like. So it does require different interventions at the tertiary end, so at the end of terms of healing. But it also, I think the trauma-informed practice stuff fundamentally puts a focus on relationships. The answers to this stuff is not to medicalize all experiences of trauma and to turn everything into a mental health condition. I get a lot of students that come to me and they say, I've got anxiety, as if they've caught it, a bit like COVID.
Yeah.
And sometimes I wonder whether some of the labels that we give in the medicalization of mental health actually are counterproductive in terms of empowerment and people feeling they have control and agency of their destiny. And while there's undoubtedly times where people will experience levels of anxiety that can be supported and worked with in relation to qualified mental health staff, there are also practices that we can do that are much broader than that, because I don't think the answers to this lie only in a tertiary service. You know, every time we think that somebody might be traumatized, they immediately are farmed out to it being under a mental health condition. I think there are other ways that we can construct it. And fundamentally, for some people, this is just about developing trusting relationships.
What can I do to help and support bring a trauma-informed practice into my team or the department or my institution?
Well, there's lots of layers in there. So let's start on the team level. It'd be great if people talked about these issues as a team, share ideas about what works and what needs to change within your team. Often in teams, there are people that are operating according to these principles anyway, whether they defined them like that with the frame of trauma-informed practice or not. There are some staff who work towards empowerment of students. They operate according to transparency. They're trustworthy. They get back to people quickly. They engage, and fundamentally they develop that relationship to enable students to flourish. And there will be ideas often sitting in particular teams. So sharing that and raising the profile of the issues of trauma and kind of connecting up the dots, if you like, can be a really useful process in its own right. For some people, they will have experienced some forms of trauma in their lives as staff, and will have worked out or worked out what works with some students. So learning from each other and having a transparent and open conversation about that can in itself be a useful intervention. Asking ourselves, can we do more within our power to minimize stress on and enhance relationship with students? Are there practices that we do which are easier for us institutionally, but if we could take a little bit more time, we might find that we could do that slightly differently? How are we careful with where we put assessment deadlines, and how that all works? Do we help students to plan and think that stuff through? So there's some logistical and practical issues that we can consider as a team. And then as a team, there will be things often in universities, particularly those that are highly controlled at the centre, where you don't have the agency to change them. Things like extenuating circumstances, processes may be decided at the centre, or exactly how things operate in particular ways, whether it's admissions, whether it's change of course, whether a range of things. Are there things that you're aware of as a team where you can build up an evidence where you're aware that things went wrong for students, and mindful of these issues, how would you like to see it differently? And developing a kind of evidence base in the terms of anecdotes and case studies to be able to present to the dean to say, this would work much better for these students for these reasons. It's a bit like a dripping tap, some of this stuff in large institutions, that different people will start raising different things, and according to those principles, and then that can start to develop momentum. As I say, we are also at UEL looking to develop a plan, which would be presented to the top of the institution, the centre of the institution. So contributing ideas to that as well is really would be really useful. There's lots of things from governance all the way through the layers of institutions that can be done to enable trauma-informed practice, whether that's training senior management and an understanding of those issues, thinking about how HR processes work, thinking about how we induct students, how we induct staff, thinking about admissions for students. There's a whole heap of issues that that through a trauma-informed lens might lead to some minor changes in practice and some more substantive changes in practice, and changes in policy. So there are a range of issues that can be looked at all levels of the institution. But at the team level, on the ground, that's where you see where the rubber hits the road, if you like, in terms of seeing the experiences for students. Documenting and thinking about and reflecting on what is in your power and what isn't to shift can be a really useful part of the picture.
And just as a side question, you are going to be publishing the research findings and stuff from your project, and will you have tips and advice like this within that report as well?
Yes, we will. In the final report, yes, we will have. We will go through a range of different levels of the institution and make some suggestions and recommendations. I have no agency to implement them, but we can certainly make suggestions and recommendations that, should the senior management team construct as useful for retention, continuation, achievement, and ultimately the finances of the university, then one might plausibly expect that some of that would be implemented.